Hey, it's Ryan with Upfit Supply, and in this video we're going to be assembling and then installing a Holman adjustable shelving unit in our RAM ProMaster, so let's get started. So just a little bit of bench work before we get into the van. We want to fully assemble the shelf first before we bring it into the van. It's a lot easier to do that outside of the van where we've got lots of room to get around and so on and so forth. So the way to assemble Holman shelves is you should kind of start from the bottom, make your way up to the top. These end panels have these built-in lances or these little tabs that stick out that the shelves actually sit on. And so you're going to make sure that you can slide those in there nicely. Well, the nice thing about the Holman shelves is you can mount them so you kind of have this cradle where you have these lips on the front and the back, or you can mount them so they're flush and flat on top. And so it's really up to you on how you want to do this. The only thing to take into consideration is there is a front lip and a rear lip. So if you mount them flush like this, you want to make sure that your front side is on the front. There's going to be a little welded nut on this front hole up here. And so if you mount it this way, still want to make sure that it's on the front. You got your welded nut here in the front. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. We have 4 shelves here. This is a 60-inch tall and I think 42 inches wide shelving unit. Assembly is gonna be basically exactly the same for all of the different Holman adjustable shelving units out there. They're built basically the same. Now the way to tell these end panels apart is they are size specific, and you can see that they taper up towards the top, and the taper is on the rear. So as you're putting this together, I actually have these flipped around. You're gonna have your left panel and your right panel. Now, one of the things you wanna take into consideration as you're beginning to mount these is, number one, where you're gonna be putting this in the vehicle. If you need to clear a wheel well, you wanna make sure that you get that measurement of how high that wheel well sits so that you can make sure that you're mounting your lowest shelf at a level that can clear that wheel well. You don't have to worry about that. For this specific shelf, we aren't clearing a wheel well, so we can mount on the lowest part of the shelf. The other thing you want to take into consideration is, are you going to be putting any accessories on here? So shelf doors or drawers or bins or whatever, you need to make sure that you have clearance for those different accessories. Some of those have specific height tolerances that two shelves need to be mounted at, so you want to make sure that you reference those installation instructions before you assemble the shelf. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to mount all of our shelves cradled like this. So you could mount it flush. It's going to be exact same installation, but I'm going to mount them this way because we have plans on putting in some bins and I want them to sit in here nicely and not come out. So again, I have my front here. This is my welded nut hole up there. And I'm going to just get started over here on one side. And this is going to be my lowest shelf. Slide it into these lances. Same thing on the right. Then you're gonna have this hardware kit here that's in your box. Just button head screws. You've got another hardware kit that has like plus nuts and spacers and all that. This is the hardware for attaching to the van. This is the hardware for assembly. So it's just really button head screws to put this together. Phillips head screwdriver, and I'm just going to loosely attach the front of these shelves to the end panels. So I'm going to be spacing each shelf evenly up this end panel. So I'm going to actually give myself 2 holes and then do my next shelf. So I'm going to have one here at the slowest locations, 1, 2, 1 right here, 1, 2, 1 right there, and then finally one at that top location. Now for this top location, it's kind of out of frame. Let's see if I can lift this up. But at the top of these tapers, there's a little gap here in the sheet metal, and that's where you can slide your top shelf into place. Now I have this flipped on its side so I can show you how we're going to attach our rear part of our shelf. In the box, you have these little, I think they're called gussets, they're little side supports. These actually go on the bottom part of the shelf, and they sit in these holes, 1, 2, 3 holes that are here in the corner, and you slide this in. First of all, there's this little tab on it that points towards the inside of the shelf. This top corner is going to slide in between the shelf and the end panel. So so it actually gets attached as you attach that screw. So that's why I'm showing you this now, because you want to make sure that you get these in place before you attach your hardware. Now for the rest of these, you can see there's already a weld nut in place, so you can take those button head screws, come in from the inside and attach it into those screws, and you'll have all your shelves attached. Now the final part of our assembly is attaching our back panels behind these shelves. There are pre-welded nuts in here for these. There's 3 of them that come with this. So we're gonna do behind this gap, and this gap. And the way that these are mounted is actually contrary to what you might think. These little tabs do not point inwards. They point outwards like this. You just line them up on these weld nuts and attach them with those same button head screws that we've been using on everything else. Okay, now that everything is loosely assembled, we're gonna go through and tighten everything up nice and tight, then we'll bring it into the van. Okay, so we moved this shelving unit into our ProMaster. This is a high roof, which is, you might be able to fit the 16-inch high in a standard roof, I can't remember. But this is the tallest shelving unit that you can get, so we have it in our high roof van. And you see we already have one piece of shelving equipment back here, our workbench. This one's gonna go right next to it, and then we actually have a cabinet that's gonna go up here. So I did all the measurements, figure out where everything goes, then I moved this into the van. You're gonna want some help. This is pretty heavy once it's all fully assembled. And you're gonna wanna make sure that you lift it into place and make sure you're not dragging it, things like that, because you could bend a leg or scratch up your floor or scratch up the shelving. Now I have our bracket kit that came with the shelving. We have our hardware kit here, and then we have a series of brackets. We've got these larger brackets right here. These are gonna be your mid-mount brackets. Then you have kind of these angled brackets, a little bit smaller, and they're used with these little metal pieces right here, and you can kind of angle them different directions. This usually is going to be used on your top rail. So in the RAM ProMaster, we have a rail that's kind of midway through here, and then there's a rail at the top part here. When I say rail, I mean really a cross member in the wall and body of the van where we can mount a plus nut to, essentially, so that we have a mounting location for our brackets. So I'm just getting this shelf in place where it needs to go. Then I'm gonna take some measurements, make sure it's nice and centered, make sure it's nice and plumb, and then I'm gonna mark where I'm gonna drill my holes for the plus nuts in the floor and in those 2 locations on both sides of the shelf. So we'll get this figured out. Now I already know on this side, I'm gonna be sharing a bracket with my workbench here that I already have in place. So we're actually gonna be going through this shelf, through the bracket, into this shelf. So we're tying these all together. So these are gonna share a mid bracket. We're still gonna do an upper bracket up here, upper bracket right here, mid bracket on this side, and then in 2 locations at each foot of the floor. Now there's not really any rhyme or reason for the bracketry other than you do want 2 mounting locations in the van. We're gonna do 2 plus nuts per mounting location. So we're gonna do 2 in the side for this upper part, 2 in the wall for this upper part, 2 in the wall for this upper part, 2 through the floor on this leg, 2 through the floor on this leg, and then you actually only need 1 on these side brackets, 1 bolt to attach it to the shelf, but you do need 2 in the van. A tool that is useful for installing these shelving units, usually when you got a 4 shelf, it stays pretty square, if you will, plumb, but you can use a level as well to just make sure your sides match. Obviously the van may not be sitting completely level, but you can get it close. Tad more. Now I'm just using a white grease pen on the floor to mark my locations. One thing you do want to be careful of, as at least in the ProMaster, but really in every van, is what you're drilling through on the floor. You want to make sure that you have clearance on the bottom of the floor, that you're not going to hit fuel line, electrical harness, anything really. And on the ProMaster, the fuel tank's up here kind of towards the cab, so that's something that we're going to check out. Make sure that we're not getting too close to that. Now because I'm not going to be using one of these side brackets over here because I'm going to be sharing it with this shelf, I'm actually going to use one of these on top here because I can mount this right here towards the inside and still reach a location on this shelf to secure it to the wall. So I'm gonna go that route. Okay, now that I've got my mid locations and my floor marked out in this upper location, I'm gonna go ahead and move this out of the way so I can start with my drilling. Now I am using a 3/8 inch drill bit, which is a little bit smaller than what the installation manual calls for, but they say that you can use it. You just have to use a little bit more effort to get those plus nuts in place once you have your hole drilled. I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I do have a drill stop on here to keep the drill from going too deep. Always going to want to use that when you're drilling holes in the van. Now this next step is installing plus nuts in all these locations that we just put in the van, the floor, over here, up here. And I've got a plus nut installer tool. They have different variations of what this looks like. Holman sells one that you can just use a wrench. Sometimes you can use a drill or impact with it to kind of set these plus nuts. Otherwise you can get a hand tool like this. If you're just doing this once or twice, get yourself the Holman tool. If you're doing this all the time, get a tool like this or the air tool. Now obviously we've got Legend liners installed in here and a floor, so that it does add a little bit of complexity in terms of, you know, there are holes in here from the factory. There a lot of times you can just expand a little bit and get a plus nut in there, but you can't see that when you've got your liners in place, so you're kind of going in a little bit blind. So it adds a little bit of complexity, but it can still be done. Okay, now that all my plus nuts are in place, I'm going to move the shelf back into place. But before I do that, I am going to use spacers here on these floor locations. I'm probably going to use 2 of them because I need to clear the floor. I want the shelf sitting on the spacer on the steel floor and not on this floor. Recommendation from Holman as well as this flooring manufacturers, you don't want to pinch the floor because it's composite. It needs to be able to float and expand and contract with the weather. So we're going to make sure that we're sitting on spacers and not on the floor. So our bolting pattern for pretty much all of our bolts is going to be a bolt, lock washer, washer, then through everything into the plus nut. So I'm going to attach the feet first. Especially when I'm dealing with spacers, I like to use a little punch right here to kind of line up my spacer and my hole with the plus nut and move it around, get it in place. Just getting these lightly threaded right now so they'll stay in place, but still have enough movement to get the rest of these in place. So I'm going to torque these down on the floor just a little bit because sometimes it does get this nice and steady, so I can make sure that as I'm attaching those side brackets that it's not going to bend the shelf or anything like that. So up here, we almost have a hole that lines up right on these brackets at the top here, but they're off by a little bit. And, you know, I could kind of pull this away and get in there, but I don't want to, you know, warp the shelf at all. So I'm just going to drill a little bit of a hole into the thinner sheet metal in the shelf here through this hole back here. Okay, we're tight right there. Now on our side bracket right here, there is no hole in the shelf that lines up with our bracket, so we're just going to put one hole through the bracket, or through the hole in the bracket into the shelf. So now that I have all of my brackets basically secured, I'm gonna do this final upper. Now the nice thing about this bracket right here is you have this little lever essentially that you can rotate it and find a hole on the shelf that you'll line up to nicely. So you got a bunch of different options right here. Like, so we've got a hole up here on top. I can go down a little bit and get this hole down here, which is what I'm gonna go into. Now this shelf is secured to the wall in 1, 2, 3, 4 locations. We actually have 4 bolts into the floor holding this in place. This is not going anywhere. Plenty of capacity here, and that just about does it for the installation of the shelf in our RAM ProMaster. Now, if you're looking for this shelf or any other equipment to get your van ready for work, be sure to check us out at upfitsupply.com. Again, my name is Ryan, and have a good one.